Now, before we start looking at the money game tonight, which is a look at some history in the light of Revelation chapter 13, I want you to go with me to a place called Mount Carmel. At Mount Carmel, God's people were there, weren't they? Elijah was God's people, and there were 7,000 who had not bowed the knee to Baal, and some of them were at Mount Carmel. So God's people were there, right? Okay? God's people who were in apostasy were there, and that was Ahab, right? He was the leader of God's church at that time. He was in apostasy because he had united with Jezebel. And in the church of Thyatira, in Revelation chapter 2, the church of Thyatira is the church that struggled with the papacy through the Dark Ages, right? And they suffered that woman Jezebel to seduce God's servants during that time. So Jezebel represents the papacy. Okay? Now, so at Mount Carmel, you had God's faithful, God's unfaithful. You had the military might of Israel. Ahab didn't go up to Mount Carmel alone, did he? He had his soldiers and his generals and his weaponry that went up with him to Mount Carmel. So the military might of Israel was at Mount Carmel. The intellectuals were there. The scholars were at Mount Carmel. The apostate religious people, the priests of Baal, were at Mount Carmel, weren't they? And the rabble were at Mount Carmel. So you had a cross-section of every kind of person that you could find in Israel at Mount Carmel. But I want you to think, there was somebody who was absolutely the instigator of the apostasy that was eating out the heart of God's people, who was not there. Who was not at Mount Carmel? Who was not at Mount Carmel, folks? Who was the woman who was behind the apostasy of Israel? Who was the woman who stayed at the palace that night, who stayed behind her ivory curtains, her silk curtains, and was not at Mount Carmel? Jezebel. Jezebel was hidden. She was not seen at Mount Carmel. And folk, in all that we see going on in our world today, with the economic turmoil, with the threat of terror attack, with just the breakdown of society, there is an evil, despicable element that is instigating and is pushing this crisis to a head. But they're hidden. They're hidden. In this crisis that we're going to see tonight, that's been running rampant through American history in the money game, there's an element that's been hidden. Oh yeah, we hear about J.P. Morgan and Associates. We hear about Rockefellers, and we hear sometimes about the Rothschilds, not very often. And we hear about Lehman Brothers and about Goldman Sachs and a lot of these other financial giants. But there's a missing link that we're not told about, who controls the money people of our world. We don't hear about them. We're going to tonight. The money game. Revelation 13, verse 17, talks about a time in the history of the United States and of the world where no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. Now, when somebody can't buy or sell, you have economic sanction, where somebody has such great control over the financial world structure that they can dictate what people do or don't do. And Revelation 13:17 talks about a time when two beasts would unite together in Revelation 13. Two beast powers would join hands and impose economic sanctions on everyone who would not receive the mark or the name of the beast. Total control of the world economy, using money to control people, using commerce to force worship. But does Revelation 13:17, does that happen overnight? That takes planning. That takes time. That takes many, many decades of time to gain that kind of control. What happens if someone stands in the way of this plan to control the global economy? What world powers will use control of the money system to force worship? Well, folk, in spite of the attempts of various people, the first beast of Revelation 13 is the papacy. The second beast of Revelation 13 is the United States of America. And Revelation 13 says that those two beasts would join together to create a world economy where they could call the shots. I want to ask you a question. We have some pretty famous people in American history up here. There may be somebody out in the audience who's saying, I hated history in school, and now you want me to look at history tonight? Folk, let me tell you something. If you can see a golden thread that runs through history, history is thrilling. But if you've got to learn dates for the sake of learning dates, and you've got to learn total number of casualties for the sake of being able to regurgitate that on a test, to say 6 million Jews, World War II, 700,000 at the Battle of Verdun in World War I. Who cares? Who cares? But if you can see a trend in history where certain power has wanted to gain their will and enforce it on the people of this world, history becomes exciting. It's exciting. James Madison in the War of 1812 and John F. Kennedy in 1960, these guys had something in common. You say, well, they were presidents. No, they had something more than that in common. They also had the same thing in common with Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, John Jacob Astor, Isidor Straus, Benjamin Guggenheim, the sinking of the Titanic, Louis T. McFadden in the 1920s and 30s, and what we are seeing today. All of those things have something in common. Let's see what it was. And how this all fits in to the papacy's drive to control the world economy. Before the American Revolution was over, a money revolution was in earnest in the United States. Robert Morris was the man selected to establish the first bank of North America. But was he really the one who dominated it? You see, folk, we have got to get past the idea of the people that are being used as a smokescreen. You see, when you see, it's like what Christian was saying this morning. We see the puppets whose strings are being pulled out in the public, but there's somebody behind them that's pulling their strings. And we've got to get beyond the puppets. See, today, folk, the man who sits in the White House, he's a puppet. He's a puppet. The man who runs the Federal Reserve Bank is a puppet. Ben Bernanke is a puppet. The man who runs the Treasury, Henry or Hank Paulson, he's a puppet. There's somebody pulling his strings. But if we don't go past the puppets, we're going to miss the play. If we think that Osama bin Laden was behind September 11, 2001, we've been deceived. If we think that Lee Harvey Oswald was the man who killed John F. Kennedy in 1963, we've been deceived. If we think that Timothy McVeigh and Larry Nichols' ammonium nitrate bomb in the Ryder truck at Oklahoma City in 1995 caused the bombing of the Murrah building, we've been deceived. We've been deceived. Have you been deceived? Christ warned 4 times in Matthew 24 for those living at the end of time. He said, watch out that no man deceive you. Have you been deceived? Yeah. You know something? When I was in the 8th grade, I may have shared this when I was up there in January in Tucker, Norcross, but I'm going to share it again. When I was in the 8th grade, I was a quarterback of a football team. I didn't know anything about Seventh-day Adventism. I wasn't raised a Seventh-day Adventist. Never heard the word till I was 20 years old. When I was in 8th grade, I went to a public junior high school. I was a quarterback on a flag football team. And the greatest play we had, I'll never forget it. We scored, I think 90% of the time we tried this play, we scored a touchdown. And the reason why is because we used deception. And all we simply did is I would call the signals, and when I got to hut 1, my flanker over on the right side, he'd start in motion coming back towards me. By the time I got the ball at hut 3, he was right over here, and I'd throw the ball to him, and we'd start around this end, and we'd run, you know. We'd do that for 2 plays. On the 3rd play, when I said hut 1 and my flanker started in motion and came back towards me, do you know what the other defense was doing? They all moved to this side of the field. They all started salivating and smiling and going like this at me. You know, like, you're crazy, man. I know exactly what's going to happen now. When I said hut 3, the defense was all over there waiting. I got the ball. I threw it to my flanker. We started around this end. Well, my halfback, who was right here, he was the fastest young man in the county. Fastest young man. He ran a 9.9 100-yard dash as an 8th grader. He took one step this way, like he was going to go block, and then he turned around. And the flanker put the ball on his outside hip, and the halfback took it right off his hip. And so as the flanker and all the rest of the team is going this way, the halfback has the ball and he's going this way. The defense has collapsed on my halfback over here, laughing. Well, you know who had the last laugh? We did. Because our halfback was down that sideline, waving at everybody, scoring a touchdown. And the reason it worked, folk, was because we deceived the other team. They thought it was happening over there when it was really happening over here. And what we are hearing in the controlled media today, they're telling you everything's happening over here, when in actuality it's all happening over here. Robert Morris was a pawn, just like Bernanke and Paulson and Bush and all these other men are pawns. They're pawns. This is taken from Wikipedia about Robert Morris. It says, in a unanimous vote, Congress appointed Morris to be Superintendent of Finance for the United States from 1781 to 1784. I'm going to go down here. 3 days after becoming Superintendent of Finance, Morris proposed the establishment of a national bank. A national bank. This led to the creation of the first financial institution chartered by the United States, the Bank of North America, in 1782. So there's a national bank headed by Robert Morris. But was he the man who was ultimately behind it? Let's see if we can figure out this. The first Bank of North America failed, but in a few years it would rise again. Do you know why the first bank failed? Because of greed, because of extortion, because of selfishness in those who were running the First National Bank of America. Sound familiar? About 10 years after that, another man was raised up. He's on one of our bills. What is it, a 10? Alexander Hamilton? I think he's on our $10 bills. Check that, would you, Milton? Alexander Hamilton's, it says this, he introduced plans for the first bank. This would be the first central bank of the United States, established in 1791, which was designed to be the financial agent of the Treasury Department. The bank served as a depository for public funds and assisted the government in its financial transactions. The first bank issued paper currency used to pay taxes and debts owed to the federal government. So here's the first central bank of the United States. But was somebody behind Alexander Hamilton? Who's really pulling the strings on this central bank? The first two banks, the Bank of North America under Morris failed in 1782, 83. Hamilton tries it, 1791. It fails too. 2 strikes, you're almost out. But who was really behind these people? Notice these statements. The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin, he says, the blunt reality is that the Rothschild banking dynasty in Europe was the dominant force, both financially and politically, in the formation of the Bank of the United States. Robert Morris and Alexander Hamilton were pawns in the hands of the Rothschilds. Going on, this one down here says, N.M. Rothschild was a pledged supporter of the Bank of the United States. This one down here says, from Gustavus Meyer's book, History of the Great American Fortunes, the Rothschilds long had a powerful influence in dictating American financial laws. The law records show that they were the power in the old Bank of the United States. So the Rothschilds were behind the central bank of the United States of America. You say, well, Bill, I always thought it was those Jewish international bankers. Just like what Tex Mars says. Now you hold that thought because I'm about to blow it to smithereens. The Rothschilds controlled and advised Morris and Hamilton and financed the establishment of the Central Bank of North America. But the Rothschilds weren't giving money to America for our benefit. This is what Mayer Rothschild said way back in the 1760s He said, let me issue and control a nation's money. I don't care who writes the laws. Now, how could he say that? Because he realized whoever had the money ruled. That's why. This is the Jesuit Rothschild's golden rule. The one who has the gold makes the rules. The one who has the gold makes the rules. The Rothschild dynasty had conquered the world more thoroughly, more cunningly, and much more lastingly than all the Caesars before or all the Hitlers after them. That's from G. Edward Griffin's book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, page 218. So the Rothschilds were up to their throats in American finance. But was there somebody behind the Rothschilds? Notice, no, I'm talking about in this world. Ultimately, the devil is behind them. But in this world, the devil has agents. Notice this statement. F. Tupper Saucy's book, Rulers of Evil, page 160 and 161. Aware that the Rothschilds are an important Jewish family, I looked them up in Encyclopedia Judaica, the Jewish encyclopedia, and discovered that they bear the title Guardians of the Vatican Treasury. The appointment of Rothschild gave the black papacy absolute financial privacy and secrecy. Again, folk, this is not a racial slur when he says black papacy. He's referring to the Jesuit order who is behind the scenes in the dark. That's what he means by the black papacy. The white papacy is the visible pope who everybody sees. The black papacy is in the dark. Nobody sees him. That's what he means. So what is this saying? The appointment of Rothschild gave the Jesuit order absolute financial privacy and secrecy. Who would ever search a family of Orthodox Jews for the key of the wealth of the Roman Catholic Church? So, folk, according to this statement from F. Tupper Saucy, who was behind the Rothschilds? The Jesuit order of the Catholic Church. And the Jesuit order of the Catholic Church pulled the strings of Robert Morris and Alexander Hamilton and held the power in the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States. The contest gets bloody. Now, before we go there, I want to read a statement from the Bible. Because you say, well, Bill, I don't buy F. Tupper Saucy, and I don't think the Encyclopedia Judaica is an authority, and so that doesn't mean anything to me. Well, that's okay. We'll hold it up to the yardstick of Scripture. How about that? Revelation 18. Notice what the Bible says. Revelation 18, verse 11 through 15. The Bible says, the merchants of the earth shall weep and mourn over her. Who's her? Her is Babylon the Great, the papacy. The merchants of the earth shall weep and mourn over the papacy. Why? For no man buyeth their merchandise any more. The merchandise of gold and silver and precious stones, of pearls and fine linen, and purple and silk and scarlet, and all thine wood, and all manner vessels of ivory, and all manner vessels of most precious wood, and of brass and iron and marble, and cinnamon and odors and ointments and frankincense and wine. And what's that next one? And what? And oil. You say, oh, but that's the stuff that comes from olives. My Bible doesn't say olive oil, does yours? It just says oil. So that could be oil that comes from olives, could be oil that comes from corn, or it could be oil that comes out of the ground. And fine flour and wheat and beasts and sheep and horses and chariots and slaves and souls of men. You know, that's an interesting concept there about slaves. I have a book called Roman Catholicism and Slavery. Do you realize that the papacy, through the merchant ships of the Portuguese and the Spaniards, as they went up and down the sea coasts of the eastern and western parts of Africa, do you realize that on every one of those merchant ships were priests? And as the merchants went on shore to sell their goods, do you know what those priests went on shore to do? They went on shore to convert the people to Catholicism. And as they were involved in their merchant trading and conversion of these tribes of Africa, the merchants realized there was great merchandise in selling the people of Africa into slavery. And the Roman Catholic priests sat by and stamped their approval on it. This man's book is absolute dynamite. Revelation 18 says that these merchants of the earth deal in commodities. Who are the merchants of the earth, folks? They buy and sell all these things. Who are they? You know something? I think there's a lot of built-up wax in my ears. So could you say your answer a little bit louder so I could hear you? Who are the merchants of the earth, folks? Yeah, that's right. It's the great buyers and sellers of the commodities of this earth, the great businessmen of this earth. The Waltons, the Rockefellers, the Gates, the Lehmans, the Chases, the Morgans, all of these great money people in the world. Now notice what Revelation 18:15 says. The merchants of these things, which were made rich by her. How were those merchants made rich? By Babylon the Great, the papacy. According to Revelation 18, folks, the yardstick, the papacy is intimately connected to and controls the merchants of the earth. That's exactly what F. Tupper Saucy said. The contest gets bloody. These are pictures of the War of 1812. Why was the War of 1812 fought? The central bank charter, the Federal Reserve Bank, if you will, of Alexander Hamilton, it started in 1791. They had a 20-year trial period. It was going to expire in 1811. Nathan Rothschild issued a warning to America if the charter wasn't renewed. Well, the Congress in 1811 refused to renew the charter for the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States. And guess what happened a year later? There was a war. The War of 1812. The war was punishment for America refusing to do business on the international banking family's House of Rothschild's terms with the First Bank of the United States. America refused to do business in 1811 with the Jesuit order and the Rothschild family. And folks, it got bloody. There was a war in 1812 over that. America won the war, but lost the war. You say, that's ridiculous. A war was fought, blood was shed, people died, but you know what happened right after the War of 1812 ended? A new central bank was formed. It was formed in 1816. The man who ran the central bank of the United States back then was Nicholas Biddle. He was an agent of the Rothschilds and the Jesuit order. Just as the man who runs the Federal Reserve Bank today is an agent of the Rothschilds and the Jesuit order. A new Rothschild agent, Jesuit agent, Nicholas Biddle. At the age of 13, he graduated from the University of Pennsylvania. The age of 13? He was a master of the science of money. By the time Andrew Jackson came to the presidency in 1828, Nicholas Biddle was in full control of the federal government's central bank. Now, folks, let's make one thing real clear. The central bank of the United States is completely independent of the government of the United States. It's above the Constitution. It does not answer to the United States Constitution. It never has, and it doesn't today. This was not the first time, twice before, once under Robert Morris, once under Alexander Hamilton, central banks had been tried. Nicholas Biddle was the head of the third attempt. What Nicholas Biddle, notice the power this man had, and this has been the goal of the Jesuits and the papacy from the beginning of U.S. history, folks. From the beginnings of America. And John the Revelator foretold it 20 centuries ago. 20 centuries ago. Biddle had one powerful advantage over Jackson, his adversary. Congress was in his hip pocket. Or more accurately, the product of his generosity was in the pockets of congressmen. Following the Rothschild Jesuit formula, Biddle had been careful to reward compliant politicians with success in the business world. Few of them would bite the hand that fed them. Even the great Senator Daniel Webster found himself kneeling at Biddle's throne. You know, folk, when you study history and you analyze these major figures in the light of the great controversy, where did they stand in the great controversy? Was it on the side of sound banking with gold as the standard? Or did they side on the part that said, let's issue paper money and load down the nation with debt? Those who said we will have a gold standard, those were following Protestant economic principles. Those who said we will have paper money and we will load debt on the country, they were following the Jesuit Rothschild formula. When you study history in that vein, it's thrilling to see. Notice this statement. Biddle was not without resources, in keeping with his belief that banking was the ultimate source of power. He had regularly advanced funds to members of Congress when delay on appropriations bills had held up their pay. Daniel Webster was a director at various times of the central bank and on retainer as its counsel. I believe my retainer has not been renewed or refreshed as usual. If it be wished that my relation to the bank be continued, it may be well to send me the usual retainers. Numerous other men of distinction had been accommodated, including members of the press. Now, I want you to get the time frame for Nicholas Biddle. He said he had the Congress in his hip pocket. Now, who do you think this might be referring to? And she was only a child. When Nicholas Biddle and Andrew Jackson locked horns in the presidency of 1828, in that time frame, the lady I'm about to put her face on the screen, she was a little tiny baby girl. She had not seen her first vision, folks. 1844 was 16 to 18 years in the future. And the Jesuit order of the Catholic Church, through the Rothschild family, already controlled the law-making fabric of the United States. So that when 1844 happened, right after the last time period, prophetic time period of 1844, Jesus could have come. Any time after that. In fact, in the early 1850s, Ellen White could say that if God's people had responded to the message that they were Laodicea, if they had responded to that message and received the white raiment and the eye salve, Christ could have come and there would not have been a civil war. Folk, everything in the world has been ripe and in place way back when Ellen White was a little girl. And so you say, well, why are we still here then? You know who God's waiting for? He's waiting for us. He's waiting for you. He's waiting for me. William Miller hadn't preached a single sermon. The great disappointment in the Advent movement was 14 years away. The Rothschild Jesuit Consortium was ready for Revelation chapter 13. Way back there, folks. Way back there. Andrew Jackson opposed the central bank. He said, is there no danger to our liberty and independence in a bank that in its nature has so little to bind it to our country? Controlling our currency, receiving our public monies, and holding thousands of our citizens in dependence, it would be more formidable and dangerous than a naval and military power of the enemy. Taken from Herman Cross. Andrew Jackson understood the dangers of a central bank. Of a central bank. And paper money. Because Andrew Jackson clashed with the Jesuit Rothschild Nicholas Biddle, Andrew Jackson won. The central bank died in about 1831. So what the Rothschilds and Jesuits did was they resorted to Plan B. When they couldn't defeat Andrew Jackson, they hired an assassin by the name of Richard Lawrence. And as Andrew Jackson was coming down the steps of the Capitol building in 1835, January 30, Richard Lawrence had 2 pistols. The first one didn't fire, the second one misfired. Andrew Jackson's life was spared. Richard Lawrence was put on trial. He was let off because they said he was insane. Later on, Richard Lawrence boasted to friends that he had been in touch with powerful people in Europe who had promised to protect him from punishment should he be caught. Well, who were those powerful people in Europe that told Richard Lawrence to kill the president who stood in the way of their central bank? The Jesuit order and the Rothschild family. No one stands in the way of the Rothschild Jesuit Central Bank, and Abraham Lincoln was next. Abraham Lincoln was next. This statement, I'm not going to read this one. This one down here is a quote from The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. It's a statement that was made by the Chancellor of Germany named Otto von Bismarck. Von Bismarck said, "The division of the United States into federations of equal force was decided long before the Civil War by the high financial powers of Europe. These bankers were afraid that the United States, if they remained in one bloc and as one nation, would attain economic and financial independence, which would upset their financial domination over Europe and the world." Of course, in the inner circle of finance, the voice of the Rothschilds prevailed. They saw an opportunity for prodigious booty if they could substitute two feeble democracies burdened with debt to the financiers in place of a vigorous republic sufficient unto herself. Therefore, they sent their emissaries into the field to exploit the question of slavery and to drive a wedge between the two parts of the Union. Folk, the Civil War was not fought over slavery. It wasn't. Tragically, it wasn't. Thank God. Thank God. And I'm not using that as, as a phrase. Thank God he was finally able to open the eyes of Abraham Lincoln to the evils and the despicable nature of slavery. But that's not why the war was fought. It was fought over finance. Von Bismarck, the German chancellor, said, "The Rothschilds, the Jesuit order, realized that a united group of states in America could gain economic and financial independence and could eventually spread that throughout the world. And they could not have that. So slavery was used to split the North and the South and to make them weak groups of states so that the Rothschilds and Jesuits could come in after the war and dominate it." That's exactly what they did. Exactly what they did. Abraham Lincoln opposed the central bank. He was gunned down by the Jesuit hired assassin John Wilkes Booth. This man, the plot to kill Lincoln, it also included Vice President Johnson, Ulysses S. Grant, the then leader of the Northern Army, and William Seward, the Secretary of State. The plot to kill these four men was hatched in the home of Mary Surratt in Washington, D.C. Mary Surratt was a rabid Roman Catholic. Her son, who escaped after the assassination of Lincoln, John Surratt, made his way up to Canada, stayed in the homes of some Catholic bishops in Montreal, was then put on a ship sent over to England. When he was finally caught, he was found in the Pope's private army. A fact of history, folks. A fact of history. Abraham Lincoln had to go. There were many attempts on on his life. I'm not going to be able to read all these, but many attempts. Before Lincoln ever got to Washington, the Catholic Church wanted to kill him in Baltimore. And there was a mob of people that wanted to kill Abraham Lincoln on his way to Washington, D.C. God had a purpose for Abraham Lincoln's life, and when that purpose was over, he died. He was immortal till it happened. They all had something in common. Madison's America opposed the central bank. The War of 1812 ensued. Jackson tried to close the bank and an attempt was made to kill him. Lincoln opposed the money power that sought to destroy the Union and was shot for it. And who was next? There was a plan in the early 1900s to establish another central bank. People that were part of the Morgan family, part of the Rockefeller group, and part of the Rothschild group met in an island off the coast of guess what state? Georgia. Yeah, in a place called Jekyll Island. Jekyll Island. They met there in 1908. And what they started to do was they started to find out how all the big financial people in the world, how they felt about the setting up of another central bank in the United States. Well, there were many people opposed to it. Among them was John Jacob Astor, Isidor Straus, Benjamin Guggenheim, among many others. Well, folk, who has been able to stand in the way of the central bank in the United States and not pay a price? Nobody has. And so there was a plan that all of these big financial power brokers would be taken out of the way in one night, in one shot. And the shot was aboard a ship called the Titanic, 1912. On board the Titanic, John Jacob Astor. On board the Titanic, Isidor Straus. And of course, their wives. On board the Titanic, there were many, many more. Benjamin Guggenheim, along with Astor and Straus, were among the many wealthy that died on the maiden voyage of the Titanic. They all had one other thing in common besides dying on the Titanic, which was their death ship. 1912, folks. The people that opposed, that had the money to try to stop the establishment of the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States, died in the Titanic. They all opposed the plans for the Federal Reserve Bank. Three of the richest and most important of these were Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidor Straus, the head of Macy's department stores, John Jacob Astor, probably the wealthiest man in the world. Their total wealth, using dollar values of their day, was more than $500 million. Today, that would be worth nearly $11 billion. These three men were coaxed and encouraged to board the floating palace. They had to be destroyed because the Jesuits knew they would use their wealth and influence to oppose a Federal Reserve Bank as well as the various wars that were being planned. That's taken from the book Vatican Assassins. What lay ahead? 1.5 years after the Titanic, the Federal Reserve Act was passed. Mission accomplished. 2.25 years after that, World War I began. A few years after that, a graduated income tax was set up in America. And a few years after that, the Federal Reserve Bank, housed in the United States, heavily supported the Bolshevik Revolution of Lenin. A summation of the Titanic. The man who had the Titanic built, J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan's family in the 1850s in England, they were about to go into bankruptcy. But they were saved out of bankruptcy by the most powerful financial institution in England, the Rothschild family. And forever after that, J.P. Morgan worked for the Rothschilds. And if he worked for the Rothschilds, ultimately, he worked for the Jesuit order. J.P. Morgan had a fleet of ships called the White Star Line. The Titanic was among those ships. He built it. Jesuit Francis Brown, a Jesuit priest, boarded the Titanic, and just before it started across the Atlantic Ocean, after taking his pictures, Francis Brown got off. Edward Smith worked for J.P. Morgan, captained his ships on the White Star Line for 25 years, was the captain of the Titanic. He had been going across the North Atlantic for 25 years. The Titanic and Edward Smith were warned 8 times. 8 times that night. You're going too fast. Slow down. You're heading into a great area of icebergs. Slow down. Why did a veteran of the Atlantic Ocean have to be warned 8 times? He shouldn't have had to have been warned 1 time. But when somebody has been told that they have a mission to accomplish, they carry it out no matter how many times they're told not to. Smith did as his masters told him. Sink it. One man, I've got his book at home, it was written by Morgan Robertson. The title of the book is called The Titan. It's about a ship that sunk in the North Atlantic on its maiden voyage. And many wealthy people died on board the ship. You say, well, that's interesting. He was writing about the Titanic. Well, you know, it's even more interesting because he wrote about it 14 years before the Titanic sunk. His book was printed in 1898. I've got a copy back home in my library. The next casualty to the money power was Lewis T. McFadden. He was the head of the Financial Committee in the United States Congress from 1920 to 1931. I'm just going to read the first paragraph. He said this, Mr. Chairman, we have in this country one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever known. I refer to the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Banks, hereinafter called the Fed. The Fed has cheated the government of these United States and the people of the United States out of enough money to pay the nation's debt. The depredations and iniquities of the Fed has cost enough money to pay the national debt several times over. Lewis T. McFadden, within a decade after the sinking of the Titanic, stood up against the Federal Reserve Bank. Any ideas what happened to him? Served as chairman of the House Committee on Banking and Currency from 1920 to 1931. There were 2 attempts on McFadden's life, a failed shooting and an apparent poisoning that made him violently ill after attending a political banquet in Washington. He was murdered in New York City in 1936. With so many attempts on his life, one would wonder who was out to get him. Some have speculated he was targeted because of his opposition to the Federal Reserve System. Folk, anybody in American history that has opposed the Federal Reserve Bank, unless God has intervened to protect them, as God did in the life of Jackson, as God did in the life of Abraham Lincoln. The Jesuit order and the Catholic Church realize the ultimate source of power in the world is money. And so anyone who has stood in their way, unless God has intervened, have died. It's history, folks. It's U.S. history. Who was next? Who stood in the way of the Federal Reserve? Who tried to dismantle the Federal Reserve? JFK. That's right. JFK. Dealey Plaza, Dallas, Texas, November 22, 1963. John F. Kennedy was killed in Dealey Plaza. One of the reasons was when Kennedy called for a return of Americans' currency to the gold standard and the dismantling of the Federal Reserve System. He actually minted non-debt money that does not bear the mark of the Federal Reserve when he dared to actually exercise the leadership authority granted to him by the U.S. Constitution. John F. Kennedy prepared his own death warrant. It was time for him to go. That's taken from James Bogright's book, Called to Serve, Profiles in Conspiracy, from J.F. Kennedy to George Bush. So what else is new? They all opposed the Federal Reserve Bank. They were cut down for it. All opposed the Jesuit Rothschild plan to gain absolute control of the financial fabric of Protestant America so that she could be used to bring the world on some distant day to a decision. The choice is ours. Who are we going to serve? Revelation 13, penned 20 centuries ago, that no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. It's been going on for a long time, folks. Our job today is not to stand up and yell at the Federal Reserve. Our job is to expose the power that's behind the Federal Reserve, so people will not be deceived.